Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, you might have seen Exodus on BBC Two this week. 3 nights, 3 one-hour programmes with real-life testimony of refugees, telling the stories of their journeys into Europe.
I survived ISIS, I survived beheadings, I survived Assad, I survived shellings, I survived the sea. I survived everything. I was almost killed for a stupid idea called the UK.
Well, the programme's aroused quite a reaction. They're still on the iPlayer, of course. There have been times when Europe can collectively excuse its messy response to the refugee and migrant crisis by saying the numbers coming here were unexpected and unmanageable in the short term. That excuse obviously wears thin as time passes. Joining me now in the studio is former International Development Secretary Andrew Mitchell, and from Brussels, the Director of Migration Policy Institute Europe, Elizabeth Collett. Elizabeth, we actually haven't spoken about the refugee crisis for very long here because, of course, we've been in the middle of a Brexit referendum campaign. But how have things changed in the last 6 months, particularly actually from the journeys that were documented in that series?
Well, I think what you saw in the television programme was fairly harrowing but fluid journeys where people were finding their passage from Turkey through to Greece and then upwards through the Western Balkans into various locations within Europe. The key change that's occurred within the European Union, one of the reasons why the refugee crisis hasn't been so much in the headlines in the last 3 months, is the instigation of a deal with Turkey to try and stem that flow from Turkey to Greece, and then the closure of the borders across the Western Balkans route. So what we see now is a far more sedentary process. So those people who had already made it to Greece but have not been able to move further through across Europe are now kept in sometimes poor reception conditions in Greece itself, and a number of people who've arrived from Turkey who've managed to make it across despite the deal over the last 3 to 4 months, finding themselves on the islands and in substantially different conditions than the islands we're used to dealing with prior to March of this year. So things have slowed down.
And people are sort of stuck. But just very briefly, in terms of the numbers leaving the places from where most came, I mean, has that number fallen dramatically?
So the numbers arriving on the Greek islands have fallen dramatically, and I think that's a combination of the message that the borders are closed now to Europe, that you will not move on from Greece, but also the proactive actions of the Turkish Coast Guard and the Turkish government itself sort of preventing departures to Greece. So on that sort of singular benchmark of the EU-Turkey deal, it has been successful in reducing numbers. That doesn't necessarily, however, reduce the number of those people who have been displaced, whether from Syria, Iraq or other countries. So it doesn't resolve the underlying problems of a large number of people displaced in the region of Syria.
Andrew Mitchell, it's months now since the peak of the migrant and refugee crisis. Has Europe improved its performance, quite apart from just blocking people out? The conditions in which they're in, has that been satisfactorily resolved?
It's a massive failure on almost every count. First of all, it's a failure to look after the 4.5 to 5 million people who are displaced within Syria, where we argued for safe havens. That was the right policy. It should have been implemented. We have failed from Europe to look after effectively the huge number of people who have gone into Lebanon and into Jordan and indeed into Turkey, where the camps and the accommodation is extremely good. So we failed them. We failed to educate all their children. We failed to give them hope because, of course, all these migrants and refugees, they don't want to recreate Syria in Europe. They want to go back to the areas from which they've been driven often under gunfire. And then moving further afield, when you get to Europe, people who do put themselves into the hands of the modern-day equivalent of the slave trader in a leaky boat in the hope of reaching a more prosperous shore, they should be properly looked after when they arrive on a European coastline, properly processed, But the aim of the policy should not be to bring them into Europe. It should be to get them back once you've dealt with the crisis.
But just in sort of humanitarian terms, you would have thought Europe could muster the money to build decent camps and to have them properly fed and to have reasonably sanitary conditions. Is that what they've got in Greece at the moment?
Well, it's better, but it's still reliant on doctors going out from Britain, for example. The European Union has not got its act together properly in Greece. But you're absolutely right in what you say. There should have been European money, United Nations money, international money to make sure that these people were kept safe, got medicine, got properly fed, got properly sheltered. And in none of those three areas which I've sketched out, which is the areas through which they go, has that happened.
Elizabeth, of course, there have been two different approaches to this. One is helping people once they arrive, and the other is helping people who are out there, which has been very much the British government's approach. It said we'd rather not encourage people to come to Europe, we'd rather help them near the, the camps in Lebanon or Jordan. How is that working out at the moment? I mean, the European picture may not be great, but how is that working out?
Well, I think the ambition is admirable in terms of thinking about how to do protection in regional origin, in part because some of the most vulnerable people don't have the opportunity to move or undertake or are capable of undertaking these dangerous journeys. One of the big challenges, however, is whether you are just doing support in the short term, food, shelter, making sure people are staying alive, versus trying to create new opportunities for people in the regional origin, which is a lot harder. And that is exacerbated by the fact that there is a funding shortfall. Despite the investments made by the UK government and other governments, there is a persistent funding shortfall that's multi-billions in nature, which means that people, once they've become refugees, tend to be refugees for long periods of time, don't find themselves finding opportunities in the region of origin because there isn't support beyond perhaps even that food and shelter, and not even in some cases. So we do have to ask the question, if that is the policy, then how much money will we have to invest to achieve that?
Elizabeth?
Alongside two other issues.
No, Elizabeth,
which
I'm sorry,
really
I'm going to have to stop you. I'm sorry, we've got a breaking story. I'm going to have to stop you. Elizabeth Collett,
No problem.
Andrew Mitchell, thanks both very much indeed.